And of course, he's given lip service to global warming since then, but I know pretty much from being a Putin follower that he doesn't believe in it. And I don't think the Chinese do either. And I think that knowing that food shortages are coming, that the normal food growing areas in the north are going to be less productive, let's say, that they are starting to build greenhouses and conserve water out in the deserts of Central Asia, where China and Russia own a lot of territory in a more southerly area in Asia, below Siberia, below some of these northern areas. Are they now sucking in that fertilizer because they realize they have to make the desert bloom to survive? So this is Jeff Nyquist, and with me is David Dubine. Hi, David. How are you doing tonight?
Yeah, doing well. It's good that we're having a second chance to talk on what originally we had both talked about politically, temperatures, weather patterns, food price rises, and it all seems to be hitting exactly what we talked about in the prior interview.
It's incredible.
And then last year, it happened the same, but it was in a different month. It was in January, and they got something like 4 feet of snow. Same, it was a record CFX snow, but in a different month just a year later. So it came earlier this year than January of last year.
Yeah, and of course, then they've got from, this is from November 24th, new peer-reviewed study, climate models overestimate CO2's impact on global temperatures by a factor of 5. So yeah, that is, if you have 5, they're making it into 25, and that's really it. And of course, school canceled in Yakutia, Russia, as temperatures plunged to negative 50 degrees centigrade. That's 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Rare late snows hit Argentina. Parts of Antarctica are holding unusually cold. That's what we were talking about earlier from November 23rd. So, I mean, we're getting it all over the planet. There's almost nobody is escaping this.
Yeah, and the power prices too. You know, you mentioned the prices going up 5x up there in the Scandinavian countries. Well, if you go to Singapore, right off of Zero Hedge today, I was reading that the prices for electricity in Singapore had gone up 12x, 1,290%, almost 13x.
Right.
Can you imagine that the average household? So think about it, and the reason I bring that up is the food prices are going to go up exponentially too. And this is another thing in history. The economy struggles because so much money of disposable economy gets put into food. And then at some point, that's 100% of earnings go to buy the daily food. That's it. There's nothing left. But then, you know, you're looking at a 12x increase in electrical prices, and I'm sure the food prices in Singapore are going up too. So at what point can a society not cope? And at what point do they go to the streets because they can't cope? And this is another fingerprint of the grand solar minimums. There's always change of government during these events. So it's pretty much, you see the indicators, what we've been talking about here, these events on the weather, these are all the indicators. It's here, it's in play. You can't really dispute it anymore. What was forecast is now here. Now let's look back in history and see how it's going to play out across the landscape with the rising food prices, rising electrical prices. I would say population migration, which has always happened, but it's not because we're all locked down because of the COVID. Like very few people can go to another place now. It's almost nigh impossible too. And before, you know, through history, if there were no, we continued the way we did in 2018, I would say 1 billion people would have moved from where they are now, from whatever they're experiencing. But then the governments can't cope either, and they always collapse and get restructured. There's new forms of farming and overseeance and thumb screwing across nations for the next, how do you top-down control a society? But the previous top-down control for society always dissolves. So how many of these are we seeing going at the moment? And then what's the forecast moving out as to how fast this will happen? Because if you're looking at increasing power prices across the planet and food prices doubling or tripling next year, at what point do they start to put military in the store because of the shoplifting? And we're seeing these smash and grab shoplift stuff. I think that is just the base. It's already planned. They're going to hit supermarkets next, which is then a reason to put troops and police in there in the supermarkets. They'll start with the high-end stuff. Nobody cares anymore. But then your access to the food, they're going to really need to control who gets the food, and it'll be rationing and how much. All right, That's the layer, the base layer of what will happen in 2022 and 3. But people are going to get really angry when they can't get their food. And if you ration to 1 loaf of bread per family.
Yeah, let's talk about the fertilizer because people don't quite understand modern farming. It used to be you would have to farm these acres and let these acres rest and replenish, and you have rotating farming, and you'd have to replenish the soil. We've pretty much, with the massive farming we're doing to feed almost 8 billion people, we're exhausting the soil everywhere, aren't we?
Well, you could put an ED on that because a lot of places it's so exhausted that you literally couldn't grow anything without the fertilizer.
Without the
So you have the
fertilizer.
medium substrate of the dirt, but there's nothing in it, zero. The only thing that goes in it is the fertilizer you put on it.
The soil's exhausted. We need the fertilizer. Why is there a fertilizer shortage?
The story is bottlenecks in CO2 production and the ammonia plant going down in Louisiana after the hurricane. Chemicals to be able to create the fertilizer.
And Russia's not exporting either, are they?
Mm-mm.
So now that's interesting. Now we happened upon this little gem. Russia and China know that the world is cooling, not warming. Their scientists know that this is happening. I've seen it. I've watched their press. They give lip service, but you probably saw the interview several years ago when the whole scandal happened about them in Britain, where they got rid of that medieval warming period, and they kind of got caught at that, and somebody asked Putin in a press conference about it, and he said, "Oh, I don't believe in global warming. I believe in global cooling," and he kind of had that little smile on his face he sometimes has. And of course, he's given lip service to global warming since then, but I know pretty much from being a Putin follower that he doesn't believe in it. And I don't think the Chinese do either. And I think that knowing that food shortages are coming, that the normal food growing areas in the north are going to be less productive, let's say, that they are starting to build greenhouses and conserve water out in the deserts of Central Asia, where China and Russia own a lot of territory in a more southerly area in Asia, below Siberia, below some of these northern areas. Are they now sucking in that fertilizer because they realize they have to make the desert bloom to survive?
That's what I would do. Now it's about actions that you see other governments making, because China put that social credit scoring and really started ramping it up about 5 years ago. Well, that's the same time that this grand solar minimum was being more confirmed each year with the solar cycle and the activity and these anomalous weather events that it was in place. So China was already setting the base to control food distribution, which they're already control it right now. So at what point, do we come behind that? And
so if your social credit score falls too low in a few years, they'll just turn you into Soylent Green, right?
Or you'll be denied. Let's say there's different ranges of bread. Okay, you have a handmade artesian loaf with olives baked in on it. All right, that's on the top shelf if you get your social credit score above 810. If you got a bad social credit score, you're eating white Wonder Bread at the bottom. They could differentiate what kind or how much.
Mm-hmm. Or you can be the one who's the meal, right?
Yeah, in a bizarro world, I hope it doesn't come to that.
I mean,
but just to go back to Central Asia here for a second, the aquifers that they're talking about tapping from Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan,
now
411,000 cubic kilometers of water reside under those areas.
Really, that's how much water's under there.
That's how much water is trapped under there. So when you start to see these transboundary or aquifers is what they call them, where it overlaps on two countries, and both Kyrgyzstan is now trading a dam and a reservoir over to Uzbekistan to get access to be able to, drill wells and tap into that boundary area of where the aquifer terminates. Because it terminates in the area where everything is drained to. So that if you're looking at primary water sources, now across the planet, there's something called primary water, where it's the main trunk line, for a better term, that feeds all the other wells within a regional area. So if you can tap into that main point where everything, so let's say like a bunch of mountain ranges push all the water into a lake, and then from that lake, then it dissipates out and refills all the aquifers, even the ones 50 or 100 miles away, 200 miles away, it all stems back from that lake refilling. You would want to start putting your wells right around there because it would be continuous. You'd never run out, ever. It's a primary water source. And there's 3 times more water in the Earth's crust than there is on the surface of all the oceans, rivers, lakes. So think about that. If you knew where the pressure was coming up from in the crust, refilling those same aquifers from beneath versus above, or a combination of both.
And we're talking about fresh water. We're talking about drinkable water, usable water.
Yeah, we're talking about usable drinkable water for agriculture with no filtration because it's coming straight from the earth. Now, if there's more calcium in it or something that could affect plant growth, yeah, you could mediate that or mitigate that. But the way they're looking at it now is the earth has all the water under it. We've squandered and polluted all the water on the top. So why not go into it now? Because I think that's why all these agreements are being made in warmer climates and all this amount of how many millions of greenhouses are being put out in these areas. They're tapping the desert. Same with the Nubian sandstone aquifer in the Sahel. If you're going to put up a new grow zone in Africa, the West African monsoon's increasing rainfall with this change into the grand solar minimum the next couple hundred years, as well as there's much larger amount in the aquifers under the Sahel and all of northern Africa. But I was just talking about the Libyan area there where Gaddafi had put out an enormous amount of agriculture, tapping that very same water source, built all these gigantic aqueducts and giant pipe systems to bring water from under the desert underneath it up and out to irrigate crops. And they were a couple 100,000 acres into production before it got all destroyed by the US. Somebody's going that same play, 2.0. Proof of concept was Libya. Now it's being really put out in play in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Central Asia.
So we're seeing the Russian-dominated Central Asia where China and Russia come together. We're seeing that being developed. Is there any sign that the Western countries are preparing, that America is preparing? Are we getting ready for this? Are we just so diluted by global warming that we think we're going to be growing? The Amazon's coming to Alaska. I mean, is there any realism here at all?
No, it's cartoon land, actually. Because the way the United States and a lot of the countries are going into it to limit your access to food, they're going to do all these hoops and hurdles where you're going to need to take the next round into the body to keep the green pass going. And if you don't have that, you won't have any access to the food. Because look how fast everything has moved, even in the last 2 months. In the mandatory across how many countries now? 3?
Now they've got
maybe more.
They got a mandate in Austria, and of course we know what's happening in Australia.
And Germany's on the bench to do that next, and then you go over to Lithuania, I think also.
It seems to be about, locking people down and getting them to get a passport, which is going to be like one of these cards you're talking about where you've got a social credit score and whatnot.
For what reason? See, the reason is control of food and access to food. I'm sure of it now. So give me a reason why you would need all this to control what and access to what.
You're controlling the food. Yeah. See, the more and more I come back to this grand solar minimum is maybe the key to understanding all kinds of things that have been put into motion, all kinds of things that are happening around the world. And when you see countries like when you see what Moscow and Beijing are doing, and what you see how the West is being gaslit, you're saying, okay, who is managing this process? To whose advantage is it? To what extent are we being herded like sheep? Reality is a little different than we're being told, right? We're going into a very dangerous, possibly a mini ice age. We got 8 billion people on the planet, and we're going to have 4 or 5 billion of them without enough food to eat. Would that be about accurate? And somebody knows it. Somebody knows that's coming. And they're trying to set up the machinery to manage this, right?
Right. And the higher echelons of power surely know what's going on. And the way it's been described or explained to me is that they're trying to save the most amount of people they can and still carry through some semblance of a society to still retain power on the other side with whatever is set up during this transition period. Mm-hmm. Because again, coming back to what we consider infrastructure, it's not going to work. So there'll be a lot of breakdowns and unexplained incidences of things breaking, snapping, and it just doesn't make sense why that route is suddenly closed. They're talking about, if you can't get to the banks or you're going to use satellite uplinks and then broadcast your central bank digital currencies or, crypto that you have. So that's just like for a real simple example. Thinking about using the terrestrial internet to broadcast transactions might not work, because if fiber optic cables are snapping and there's electrical outages, etc. If you had your home point and everybody had a satellite dish and everybody had a solar panel or whatever device, battery backup that would power that, you would be able to transmit up into a satellite network. Because quantum, Chinese quantum system was way back, what, 2015 or so, to do the same thing with cryptocurrency transactions. And that was the whole, wow. Even if you had a full-on power grid down and you had a internet connection up to satellites, like Starlink's a famous one now that's getting, they're not really ready yet, but envision that, or the quantum satellite network up there put up by China. You could broadcast cryptocurrency transactions directly from your base station, that's all renewable powered, solar panels, etc., up to the satellite, and that would then broadcast it down into the next place where it needed to verify whatever it needs to be verified. And that could be something encrypted, it could be a cryptocurrency transaction, it could be a simple wire transfer, through the SWIFT system, whatever it is. And that's the way we're going to work around at least some of these simple, what's considered simple power outages and cable breakages. So, I mean, that's an example. So somebody's planning for this already, but the human element, how are you going to pull 8 billion people to the next side? You're not. It's simply not going to happen. So there's going to be damage along the way. They're willing to take the loss. They're going to try to pull some or as many people they can. Well, I don't know exactly the number chosen to the other side of this chaos, unless you're self-sufficient, and then you can do it yourself. But once you get on the other side, let's say these self-sufficient communities rock on and they're way more bountiful and more people want to stay there, and then you pull to the other side, and then suddenly you got the control grid back, and then the governments are going to be like, wait a second, y'all can't be that. So you have to be on our system again. What push and pull is that going to come to? If the communities get really self-sufficient over the next decade or so to the point where they're autonomous, but then governments will be functional in 2032, 2033 again, because everything will stabilize. This is only a 10, 12-year event. Everything's going to stabilize mid-2030s. Then what? The government's going to be back in and they're going to want full control again. But wait a second, this entire section of society split off over here, totally self-sufficient, and doesn't want to go back on that grid at all.